So let's say you're at the stage where you have the correct number of stitches for your project. Now what do? You finish that. So now you go into your second step. You've cast on and you need to reorganize the way that you're working. So I am right-handed and I cast on using my left hand. So for me, it doesn't matter. There are many ways to cast on. Some people do it the opposite. It's fine. And we have right and left-handed knitters. But for this purpose, I'm having to switch. So I hold the yarn in my left and I transfer it to the needle on the right. So now we're not going to pick up any of this tail yarn. So we actually need it out of the way. We have our ball. I like to keep the ball up somewhere separate. Oftentimes I put it in a bowl so it doesn't flop around too much. So as we're set up, we have our stitches closer to the edge, but not falling off. If you have them way up or bunched, so there's pressure, it's much easier for them to just fall off. So you want to keep the bulk of them back and I oftentimes will use my finger to sort of push up a few. So there's a few near the edge. So let's go under. For a knit stitch, you go under, making an X. You pick up. I'm doing a slow motion version for you here. You put that yarn, that working yarn, in between in the X. And that's going to be your new loop. And you just find the little hole between them so that that new piece is the loop that you pull off. And again, you can use that other finger if you want to kind of push off the stitch part way and then grab it. So you're finding, now you don't want to split. If I go in the middle there, sometimes you can accidentally make either two tight stitches that you don't recognize or a snarl. So you're trying to make sure that you have the hole to dive into, go over the needle and pull it off. Now people do different versions of knitting depending on continental or the European style, UK style. There's different styles of knitting, and it's not so much about how you put the loop on. Is it your needle that picks it up? Is it your finger that throws it over? It's more about transferring it in whatever way works for you. So I find that the very first time that I'm transferring cast on stitches and putting on another layer is the trickiest time. This is when I tend to mess up. Cast on is tough, but this can be really tough too. They tend to be a little tight, a little tough to get into. But that's why I do the long tail cast on, because they are more stable. It's almost like you're working on a second row. If you just do, if you just loop it over without doing the long tail cast on, then can get a lot tighter or looser. There's more fussing to be done. You can see how I'm using my finger a bit, going slowly as I talk to you. And sometimes I'm pulling down with my hand. And you may have to drop more often and actually pick it up and look over here, stretch those out. See how it's kind of tight in there? So sometimes if you pull it just off the tip, you can get it on there. Pull it off. I'm trying to go nice and slow so that you can see what I'm doing, kind of at a speed you might be working at. So sometimes I'll stretch that loop up, find the hole. See how it wants to split? you could easily accidentally split that stitch and end up with a little bit of a mess. So watch for that splitting. And some yarn, of course, is going to be more prone to splitting. Like if you look at this one that I'm using is the same as this. I have a tight, you see that? Fairly tight spiral, small strands wrapped together. But something like this baby alpaca has slightly a larger spiral with slightly larger strands and less. It only has 2 twined together. Do you see that? So it would be really easy to accidentally split this and think that you did it right, and then guess what you end up with? An extra stitch to deal with and a weak spot in the knitting. So be watchful for that as you go. I mean, you need to watch for it all the time, but this especially, this stage when it's a bit awkward, there's not any fabric yet to pull the stitches down with gravity. You know, once you get some fabric on here, it's a little easier because the stitches themselves kind of weigh down what you're doing. Pull it away from the needles, which kind of provides that little gap to get into. But right now I'm having to really force my way in to that gap. Oh, and you see, look, I did it on accident. That's called splitting a stitch. And so I saw that, I back out and go in again carefully. Oh, that time it was fine. Oh, you can check the back side as you go in and make sure that you didn't split one. And if you mess up a few times on your cast on and you tried to knit a few times, what tends to happen is the spiral of your yarn might be affected. So you might get, you know, it might be starting to fray apart. It won't be twisted as much. So you have to be mindful of that. And that's why instead of practicing a bunch on your really nice yarn that you only have, you know, 1 skein or 2 skeins of for your nice project, if you have a backup little piece of yarn that you can practice and warm up with sometimes, that's a really great idea. I had a actually saw that suggestion on a video the other day where you have some easy yarn that you just keep in your bag and you try out all the tricks. You know, if there's a new stitch that you don't know or you need to practice or warm up because you feel tight, do it on the practice swatch, on the practice yarn, instead of your fancy project. And it could still be fancy yarn, but it could be something simple, you know, like a scarf that you just every once in a while work on. Or it could just be swatches that you felt and turn into pot holders or something like that. So once you get to the end, you know, go ahead and take a look. You know, for at a beginner level, it's hard if you notice a mistake far back to go back and fix that because you're still learning to see what's happening. You can see we have a little row of V's, those little V's for every stitch, and that's the knit side of the work. And on the other side, it looks like pearls. You see the bars running across the back instead of V's. So if I were to keep going like this, your work might end up curling a little bit. That's what's typical. This stitch is often called the stockinette stitch. It works really well for in the round, like if you're doing a hat on double pointed needles or endless needles. And if you keep doing the same, if you were able to go in a spiral and just keep going with knitting, it would be stockinette. Or if you were to do purl on the back side, it would be stockinette because you would be matching these pearls. But in this case, we're going to keep with the knit stitch. So even though it looks different, we're going to knit in it the same way we did before. That's not the right needle. This is the right needle. So you just make your X again, pull and get in there and pull it off. And then I like to kind of, sometimes you can give it a bit of tug. Tension, your tension is how loose or how tight you tend to knit. And that is a natural thing that comes from practice. And new beginners, and even some intermediate knitters will sometimes be working on their tension, which means they might have an uneven tension, or they tend to knit too tight or too loose. And so practicing being consistent, like every time you stop, you know, checking to see that it's kind of even looking. And then when you go again, making sure that that first stitch, you know, is still the same, still matches the rest. Sometimes when people stop, they kind of make a looser stitch when they restart, or a tighter one. It's these little habits we fall into that eventually start to fade as you gain more skill and you can notice what's really going on there. So for me, sometimes I like to just kick out a little extra yarn on the ball. That's why one of the reasons I like a bowl, because if you put your yarn in a bowl, then it will just roll around in the bowl. Even if, like this one, how it's kind of flattened, it's not exactly round. It will roll in a smooth bowl a little bit better than on a flat table. So I'm just carrying on with the same stitches, noticing that I'm not splitting anything. No split stitches. And you can see it's a lot easier and